Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to this third instalment of the Chronicles of the Age of Chivalry. We are looking at the life of Henry III as we enter the latter stages of his reign, and enjoying the detail of the life and times and chronicles within. Let's start this next part with Simon de Montfort and Civil War. So above here, the mutilation of Simon de Montfort after the Battle of Evesham in 1265. So although he was Henry III's brother-in-law, de Montfort was nevertheless the only baron who refused to recognise the king's authority when Henry repudiated his earlier agreements with the baronial party. Although de Montfort was reviled by the court, many regarded him as a saint. And this is his seal. A courageous and skilled strategist, de Montfort's Parliament of 1265 was a precursor of the modern institution. Here's a little chronicle of him. At this time, the King of England, a peacebreaker assuming the guise of a peacemaker, played the role of David sending Uriah into battle. "Go back to Gascony," he said to Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. "As you delight in stirring up war, you can find plenty of it there." Some Gascons were listening, and this barbed remark was well received by them. But the Earl was not dismayed, and answered quickly and eagerly, "Yes, I will gladly go there too, and I swear I will not return, even if I get no thanks for it. I have subdued the rebels and made your enemies the footstool under your feet." The Earl of Leicester went straight off to France, which he knew well, and with financial help from friends and relatives, got together a huge and powerful army of mercenaries, promising them rich pickings from the spoils of war. They followed the Earl like greedy leeches, and he was burning the desire to avenge the slander made against him. Meanwhile, King Henry III, ignoring or pretending to forget the fact that he had twice already given Gascony to his brother Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and confirmed this by charter, was planning to hand it over to his eldest son Edward, then aged 13. This was largely the result of private conversations with the Queen, Eleanor of Provence. So when Richard heard about this scheme, he stormed out in a state of unconcealed fury, cursing the transient fickleness of the court. The King of England immediately ordered an assembly of all the Gascons who, still at his behest, remained in London, including the Archbishop of Bordeaux and his followers. There he made a formal public announcement that he had conferred Gascony upon his eldest son, Edward. "Oh, Richard, my brother," Henry added, "doesn't want Gascony. He doesn't even want to go there. Rough seas have emptied his stomach, and Gascony has emptied his purse." The Gascons welcomed his announcement, and forthwith did homage to Edward and swore the oath of fealty. Edward presented them with splendid gifts of gold and silver, collars, belts, and silken garments. The king did, however, reserve to himself the chief element of lordship, that of allegiance. They all feasted together in celebration, and some idle boasters among the banqueters made threats against Earl Simon de Montfort, saying that he would be cut up into little pieces or banished as a landless exile. Then the Gascons embarked and quickly set sail for home, but as soon as they landed, and before they had a chance to recover from the journey, they found Earl Simon de Montfort awaiting them at Le Riot with a huge army. The Gascons called together many of the Earl's enemies, telling them by way of encouragement that they now had a new lord who was getting ready to blunt Simon's horns. They assembled a strong force, apparently well able to deal with Earl Simon, and advanced to the attack. When they came across an ambush which the Earl had placed in a narrow byway, hoping to catch them unawares, they were not unprepared. There was a bloody skirmish in which the Gascons took captive a brave knight whom the Earl had put in charge of the ambush. They led him away in fetters, very pleased with themselves. Earl Simon de Montfort was on the lookout for any sign of battle, and suddenly one of the ambushers, who'd made his escape on a swift horse, galloped up to Simon, bleeding from his wounds and dishevelled. Breathlessly he told them how their leader, that night the Earl had been taken captive. The words were hardly out of his mouth when Simon dug his spurs into his horse's flanks and whirled away in a desperate bid to free his knight. The Gascons, trusting in their numbers, made a concerted attack on the Earl. In the menacing press of his enemies, Simon de Montfort was unhorsed and in deadly peril, when the knight whom he had just set free saw him and cried, "Oh, my brave lord, I must save you as you saved me." He charged straight through the enemy line and dragged the Earl onto his own horse. The battle lasted nearly half a day, and in the end the Gascons were defeated, scattered, or put in fetters. That was a glorious day for Simon de Montfort, a day of triumph after he had been close to death, after his enemies no longer dared to mutter against him. King Henry III summoned a council of bishops to convene in London on the 13th of October. An order from Pope Innocent IV that the English Church should pay the king a tax of 1/10 of its annual income was promulgated, valuable church of Preston, which had been held by the late William Haverhill, the royal treasurer, with an annual income of more than £100, was conferred by the king upon a certain chaplain in the service of the king's half-brother, Geoffrey de Lusignan. The king, his brother Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and the whole court treated this man like a witless fool or buffoon, guffawing at his jokes as if he were some silly jester or mace carrier. This chaplain was an ignorant point-of-view with no conception of how to behave. Once, when the king and his brother were strolling in the orchard of St. Albans, we saw him pelting them and other nobles with clods of earth, stones, and green apples, stuffing unripe grapes into their eyes as if they'd gone quite mad. In speech, attire, and behaviour, even in physical size and appearance, he would be considered contemptible, a clown rather than a priest, and a disgrace to his order. It was to men like this that the King of England entrusted the care of many thousands of souls, rejecting England's ample supply of suitably educated and competent clerics who understood the language of the natives and were able to instruct them in their ignorance. What I love about reading these chronicles, and what I'm really enjoying about this book so far, is just how comparable the accounts are to modern day society as well. This almost reads like somebody's rant on a social media post or an email to colleagues or an instant message about a boss giving promotions to people who are unbecoming and then mocking those people. So we just heard the name Chris Tester, Robert Chris Tester. Here's a column of text from Chris Tester's index of St. Augustine's work. Look at that beautiful intricate calligraphy. Here he is enthroned as Bishop of Lincoln. He bitterly resisted interference from the king, either by taxation or the appointment of unsuitable personnel to ecclesiastical offices. And one of his last acts was to oppose the use of money set aside for crusading for a war in Gascony. So he was an outstanding figure in the English medieval church. Born at Stradbroke, Suffolk, in about 1170 to humble parents, he studied at Oxford and gained a distinguished reputation for his knowledge of the natural sciences, mathematics and theology. He became the university's first chancellor, and in 1229 headed the new Franciscan School of Theology. When he was already about 65, he was elected Bishop of Lincoln, the largest see in England, and held this office until his death 18 years later in 1253. He carried his crozier on his travels as a symbol of the pastoral nature of his office. His principal preoccupation was the care of his flock and the reform of clerical morals and discipline. This emphasis, unusual amongst 13th century bishops, led him into numerous conflicts with the king and the pope. He first visited the papal court at that time in exile in Lyon in 1245 to resolve a dispute with his own cathedral chapter about his reforms in the Diocese of Lincoln. He gained a favourable verdict from Pope Innocent IV on this occasion, but next time, in 1250, his breach with the papacy became irreconcilable, openly criticising new harsh exactions laid by the Pope on the Church to finance his wars with the Holy Roman Emperors, drawing on his own experience as a Diocesan and on the lessons of the Bible and nature. Chris Tester pointed to the papal court as the centre of the evils currently besetting the Church. So the Pope can see that he's becoming too influential, and tried to give an unqualified nephew of his, Frederick de Lavagna, a stipend from the Lincoln Cathedral. Chris Tester repeated his charges in a stinging letter. He received little support from the other English bishops and died a disappointed man. But he was harsh and unbending as a part of his fundamental principles. He was imaginative and very human. Courtesy and hospitality were renowned, and on one occasion he told an over-solemn friar to drink a glass of wine as penance. His scientific work shows a uniquely English emphasis on observation. One, a treatise on optics, was so valued that it was still being reprinted as late as the 16th century. He invented a series of hieroglyphs which stood as index terms, and chose a flower to represent imagination, which had no place in contemporary scholastic thought. It was reported that the heavenly bells were heard on the night of his death, and holy oil was said to flow from his tomb, to which pilgrimages were made. He miraculously restored the sick to health, and even brought one man back to life. There we are, the power of individual creativity and will. Absolutely crucial to maximise the outputs of humanity, I believe. The King's Beasts. Really getting into the nooks and crannies of the king's life, aren't we? Here is a sketch of an elephant presented to Henry by Louis IX. Could you imagine seeing the elephant for the first time living somewhere like England? So Henry II, Henry III's grandfather, created the first royal menagerie in the 12th century when he gathered lions, leopards and lynxes, camels and even a porcupine in his park at Woodstock in Oxfordshire. Richard the Lionheart, his son, is said to have collected a crocodile while on crusade in the 1190s and brought to London, where it escaped into the River Thames and was never seen again. Henry III, however, surpassed both of them and amassed the largest and most impressive menagerie of all the Plantagenet kings. He had a house built in the Tower of London in 1237 for 2 royal leopards, and allowed their 2 keepers and 3 grooms with 4 horses as much as 18 shillings, 7.5d for 10 days' wages. Henry also owned 2 bears. The first was presented to him by the mayor of Northampton, the second a spectacular polar bear sent from Norway in 1252, controlled by a muzzle attached to an iron chain, except whilst on fishing expeditions in the Thames when it was secured by a long, strong rope. The most spectacular animal in Henry's zoo was an elephant, given to him by Louis IX, taken by water from Dover to London, where it was kept in a specially built house, 40 foot long and 20 foot wide. Beside its own keepers, it was admired by the populace who flocked to see it, but the combination of a chilly climate and cramped quarters proved too much for it. In 1258 the elephant died and was buried in the Tower, Bailey. Shortly afterwards it was disinterred and presented to the sacrist of Westminster Abbey on the King's special orders. No one knows what became of its bones, but Matthew Paris's spirited drawing of the unfortunate beast has given its immortality. Sad, isn't it? Must have had a horrible life, being all kept up in a small house in the cold. The famous Marco Polo and his travels. So here's a plan of Malacca or Malay, an important trading route for the Spice Islands, and a trading ship from India lands with its cargo here in Iran. So when the 17-year-old Marco Polo set out for Cathay, China in 1271, he wasn't the first or only European to go there. What distinguished him from others was the account he left of experiences, the description of the world, which he dictated while serving time as a prisoner of war in Genoa in the 1290s. So China was the source of silk, the most highly prized luxury textile, and of fine porcelain that attracted travellers for centuries. The Silk Roads across Central Asia to the Black Sea had been well known in Roman times, when merchants had contacts with both China and India. But trading links were disrupted after the Muslim conquest in Asia during the 7th and 8th centuries. The expansion of European trade from the later 11th century led to an increased demand for Eastern luxury goods. So, for the first time in 6 centuries, Europeans could travel overland to China in relative security, and it was with that Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, Marco's father and uncle, leading Venetian merchants, exploited. Their inspiration wasn't love of adventure, but hope of commercial advantage. Marco travelled in their company on his famous journey, leaving Venice in 1271. In 1275, before the Venetian caravan eventually reached the court of Kublai Khan, a successor of Genghis Khan at Peking, they arrived without the friars who'd accompanied them to preach to the Mongol leader, for they'd lost heart on the way and turned back. China was more advanced than Europe, a sophisticated technology that had already invented printing and gunpowder, and with a complex mercantile organisation using banks, credit and paper money. Profiting from the support of Kublai Khan, the Polo brothers set out to work as merchants, assembling goods for caravans to the west. Marco tells in his book about how he learned the Mongol language and entered the Chinese civil service, where he quickly attracted the attention of the great Khan, who was always eager to employ able foreigners. Later, Marco was, by his accounts, a privy councillor entrusted with a number of important missions. He reported on Burma after 1287, and later went to Ceylon to buy the Buddha's tooth, the most important relic in Asia. But not all of Marco's reminiscences are accurate. His claim that Polos were present at the siege of Xianyang in the Sung Empire, and that their knowledge of siege weapons brought it to a satisfactory conclusion can't be true, nor can Marco have been governor of Yangzhou for 3 years. After 15 years in the service of Kublai, the Polos decided to leave for home, but the Khan refused permission. Only his death made it possible for them to escape and return to Venice after 21 years. So it sounds like a bit of a tall tale teller as well as a huge source of information and influence. Matthew Paris as artist. A self-portrait here of Matthew Paris, who was unparalleled in the range of material he sought to illustrate and the inventive techniques he pioneered, and a fragment of a drawing, the subject's King Lear and his daughters. So when I said at the very beginning of the first part about all the art style looking the same, then I guess Matthew Paris was the prolific artist. It's all come from him. He was a man of many talents and cat-like curiosity. Not content with writing the Chronica Majora and other chronicles and translating lives of the saints, he illustrated them as well. He was profoundly interested in all matters artistic. In the Gesta Abatum, he describes the main artists at St. Albans in the early 13th century and their works. His work, executed in the trowel drapery style, which was fashionable in North Europe around 1200, is lively and inventive. He used a tinted drawing technique rather than full-colour painting, and similar drawings have been an English specialty since Anglo-Saxon times. He wasn't the first to do this, but he appreciated this lack of constraint and drew anything that appealed to him when he was looking at his own inspiration. He illustrated a genealogy of the kings of England with a series of stereotype portraits, drew astrological diagrams, maps of Britain and the Holy Land, schematic itineraries to Apulia in Italy. In 1255 he went from St. Albans to London to inspect and draw the first elephant, as we saw previously. He wasn't tied to producing service books, unlike most monastic artists, which had to have standardised illustrations for the church and rich laymen. Nor indeed does he really compare an artistic quality with his unknown colleagues at St. Albans, but he seems in short to have been a gifted amateur. Both the omnivorous interests reflected in his drawings and their slightly amateur quality are reminiscent of his French near contemporary, the mysterious Villard de Honnecourt, who littered his sketchbook with anything: buildings, sculpture, painting or mosaic that caught his eye. So at the time that Matthew was illustrating his chronicles, the monasteries were beginning to lose their monopoly on manuscript production. An increasingly literate laity was demanding its own books, and illuminated manuscripts are no longer destined mainly for monastic libraries and churches. Personal service books like the Book of Hours, luxury religious books such as Psalters and Apocalypses, the medieval equivalent of the coffee table book, though only, of course, for the very rich, and secular books like bestiaries or books of beasts were often brought from non-monastic artists. William de Brele is an example. Although he shows himself as a tonsure in one of his illustrations, he was married, so he was clearly only in minor orders. Now, of course, something that is famous within England, Scotland and Wales, and Northern Ireland is the universities on offer. A huge part of our cultural heritage. This is modern Oxford, England's oldest university, established in the early 13th century, so about this time we're talking about. And here is Merton College, founded by Walter of Merton. Beautiful buildings, aren't they? I have a bit of a chronicle here, where on the 9th of March, a number of Masters of Arts from the University of Oxford, about 9 of them, came to the King at St. Albans in St. Osmond's Chapel, and lodged a plea against Henry Lexington, Bishop of Lincoln. He was, they complained, trying to weaken the rights of scholars in defiance of the ancient and accepted statutes of the university. The same day one of the brothers, the present writer in fact, had a more private word with the King, and said, "My lord, for God's sake, have a care for the church. It is already very insecure. The University of Paris, nurse and teacher of so many holy prelates, is in great turmoil. I am much afraid that, if Oxford goes the same way at the same time, the whole church will come to grief, since Oxford ranks only second as a school of the church, or is indeed rather a very foundation of the church." The King answered, "God forbid that such a thing should happen, especially in my time." A day was set at the approaching Parliament for the Bishop of Lincoln, Henry Lexington, Chancellor of the University, to reply, so that when both sides had stated their cases, some agreement might be reached. And in 1258 Henry III persuaded Pope Alexander IV to commute a promise he had made to go on crusade to the Holy Land, to an undertaking to capture Sicily held by Manfred of Hohenstaufen, a legitimate son of Frederick II and papal enemy. Henry accepted the crown of Sicily for his second son Edmund, and demanded large sums of money from the English barons and clergy to finance his crusade. The barons resolved to agree only on condition that Henry could reform his government and administration according to a plan which they'd drawn up. So at the beginning of the 13th century, ambitious and well-connected Englishmen in search of education usually went abroad to one of the great European universities, such as Paris or Bologna. No English institution could provide teaching of a comparable range or level. As late as the 1230s, Thomas Cantilupe, the son of a great royal minister, and therefore given the best education money could buy, went to Paris and then Orleans. So less wealthy scholars had to seek out several hundred of schools connected with cathedrals and monasteries in English provincial towns. Oxford was the only one to offer an education in any way approaching that found abroad. By the 13th century, Oxford was organised very much like Paris as a university, a corporate association of teachers, the masters. By 1214 they had elected their own head, their chancellor, as they still do today. The curriculum was also similar to that found at Paris. Scholars who could be as young as 14 attended an initial arts course, the Trivium, lasting 5 years, which comprised logic, rhetoric, and Latin grammar. On completing this, the student became a Bachelor of Arts and could take the more advanced Quadrivium, a 3-year course in astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music, for his mastership in arts, which licensed him to teach. Only then could he undertake the higher studies of canon and civil law, philosophy, medicine, and theology. So actually this is the first time I think I've come across this information, because I've never sought it out. I've always been interested why qualifications from a university are known as of Arts, Master of Arts, Bachelor of Arts. But of course it stems to the very beginning, where actually the course would be, I guess, one size fits all. You'd have to take in the arts, which compose of fundamental subjects. So several factors contributed to give Oxford its preeminence. The Bishop of Lincoln, its nominal overlord, was a remote figure, and the university was therefore free from petty restrictions. So unlike Cambridge, about which little is known in the 13th century other than that it existed, it was strategically placed in the central south of England. Its reputation was advanced by a series of famous teachers, of whom the greatest was Robert Grosseteste, who lectured at the university between 1207 and 35 and was elected its chancellor before becoming Bishop of Lincoln. In 1255, Thomas Cantilupe returned to Oxford to complete the studies he started at Paris and Orleans. His decision marked the coming of age of the university as a centre of learning comparable to Paris, and by this time Oxford boasted well over 1,000 students who lodged with the burgess of the town or lived in halls owned by the masters. When in the second half of the century a master, Walter of Durham, a graduate, Walter of Merton, and a great baron, John of Balliol, and his wife, Dervogilla, made bequests to provide permanent support for small numbers of students, the result was the foundation of the university colleges, Merton and Balliol. Like Thomas Cantilupe, Walter of Merton became Chancellor of England and a bishop. Oxford was now providing education for men destined for the highest positions in church and state, which I suppose it still does to this very day. So we have Revolution and Reform. This is a seal belonging to Simon de Montford, one of the Committee of 15 who ruled under the provision of Oxford. Of course there's the de Montfort University as well, which uses the same seal. This is a portrait of him, and this is the plan to limit the king's powers drawn up in Oxford in 1258. Here's another shot of Oxford. So at home, Henry's aim was peace. He enjoyed it for many years. His policies in 1258 still produced a political revolution, followed by 3 years of savage civil war. So the spark was struck by William de Valence and Aymer, a bishop-elect of Winchester, sons of Hugh de Lusignan and Henry III's half-brothers. The Lusignans were hated for a variety of reasons. They absorbed a disproportionate share of the king's patronage. Young and arrogant, they were often violent and lawless, and in addition were beginning to threaten Savoyard control of 19-year-old Edward, the king's son and heir. In 1258, Aymer's men attacked and killed servants of the Baron John Fitzgeoffrey. The king, with chronic misjudgment, refused John legal redress. baronial resentments against the Licinians, seen as a malign influence on the king, were already running high, and now they boiled over. At the same time, the ludicrous Sicilian enterprise, wherein Henry had failed to gain the crown of Sicily for his son Edmund, and had incurred massive debts, emphasised his incompetence and irresponsibility. If he was going to govern, he needed help. So regions had also exploded, as well as elements of government. People were oppressed by barons. The king had allowed too free a reign. They could ignore the grievances of lesser men because, they needed support in their struggle to make the king rule responsibly. And as a result, a programme of reform was introduced that was far more radical and wide-ranging than any seen in England before or since. A mere reissue of the Magna Carta was deemed inadequate, because it didn't say anything about patronage and policy, and the king could continue to foul at the Licinians and pursue the Sicilian venture. The charter also said nothing about who should fill the major offices of state, or should be appointed sheriffs, and upon what financial terms they should hold office. The provisions of Oxford in 1258, followed by the provisions of Westminster in 1259, tackled these things. A council of 15 was imposed on Henry III, who could not govern without his consent. The office of Justicar was restored, and the royal chancellor and treasurer was subordinated to the council's control. 3 parliaments were to be held each year, summoned by a commission of 12 barons elected by their fellows. Major wardships and escheats could be granted out only with the consent of Parliament, and in addition, sheriffs had to be local knights and were to be paid a salary, and inquiries were made into abuses of the system by royal and baronial officials. Many barons, however, were uneasy with a programme of reform that threatened their own position and gave too much scope to Simon de Montford's ambition. They became disunited, and in 1261 Henry recovered power, his greatest political triumph. Here's a wonderful painting here of Henry III landing in Aquitaine with his retinue. I always love the proportions they have for things like the ships. And here's the wine trade that was instrumental in keeping Gascony loyal to the English crown. So the possession of the Duchy of Gascony by the kings of England was a relic of the great Plantagenet dominions collected together in the 12th century. These possessions were part of a collection of territories including Normandy, Anjou, Brittany and the Kingdom of England. So although the Plantagenet behaved as if they were independent, all their French lands save Gascony were held as fiefs as the King of France for the King of France, and as a result, in 1203-4, Philip II was able to deprive Henry II's son John of most of his vast French domains. Philip's campaign, and won by Louis VIII in 1224, left Henry III in effective control of only the Channel Islands and Gascony. These had obviously always been a cause of friction between the kings of England and France. Henry III, true to the traditions of his ancestors, continued to call himself King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou, and even launched a military campaign from Gascony in 1242-3 with negligible results. Gascony itself was profoundly loyal to the English crown, principally because of the lucrative trade in wine between its chief town Bordeaux and England. Love a bit of Bordeaux red. Henry ruled mainly through local Gascon officials until 1248, and sent Simon de Montford to govern the duchy. His heavy-handedness provoked a general rebellion, and then in 54 Henry's son Edward was put in to replace him. It continued to be restive, though, with unending disputes with the French monarchy, and emerging troubles with English barons probably influenced Henry to seek a settlement of Gascony's status with Louis IX. The result was the Treaty of Paris, finalised in 1259. In essence, Henry agreeing to abandon his claims to Normandy, Maine, Touraine, Anjou and Poitou, and accepted that he held the previously entirely independent Gascony as a fief of the French crown. In return, he was given substantial sums of money and rights in the dioceses of Perigueux, Limoges and Caen, together with the promise that after the death of Alphonse of Poitiers, Louis IX's brother, he would receive some of his lands, the Agenais, Quercy and Saintonge. The treaty, agreed amidst great pomp and ceremony, was an honest attempt to find a diplomatic solution to a permanent sore in relation between the two kings, that led to a kind of peace. At the time, though, critics in both countries accused their rulers of giving up too much, and difficulties in applying the terms soon built up acute tensions in southwest France. The King of France started to intervene in the duchy's law and administrations in breach of local custom, and although Alphonse of Poitiers died in 1271, the English crown did not receive the Agenais until 1279, or Saintonge till 1289, at which time it abandoned its claim to Quercy altogether. Deep resentment against both the French and English kings grew up on the Gascon borders, and disputes between the two jurisdictions were to provide the catalyst for future conflicts between England and France. So Louis IX, who we've mentioned a few times, wooden sculpture of him here has had a big influence on Henry III's reign. But he was a rare figure in the medieval period, a deeply pious man who was also an effective king and was canonised as a saint within 2 decades of his death. So his secret was to combine a sense of religious duty with the ability to excel at the basic responsibilities of kingship. He washed the feet of the poor, but was also a fine soldier who insisted on the rights due to a king of France. He became king at the age of 12. His pious and possessive mother, Blanche of Castile, was regent until he came of age in about 1234, and retained a powerful influence over him until her death in 1252. In 1244 he came close to death, and on recovering vowed to go on crusade. Thereafter, for the rest of his reign, his principal preoccupation was the recovery of the holy places for Christendom. To this end he strove to bring about peace in the West, and he went on crusade twice. For both expeditions he mobilised the full financial and administrative strength of his French kingdom. Nonetheless, his Muslim opponents proved too strong. Louis was captured and later ransomed on the first of his crusades and died on the second. He had been ill even before the crusade began. He felt deeply about his failure in the first, and he subsequently strove harder than ever to rule justly. While his way of life became increasingly austere, there were significant administrative developments during his reign, including the creation in 1247 of special emissaries, usually friars, to root out corruption in local government. They had the indirect consequence of increasing royal authority. Louis was swift and firm in crushing rebellious barons, strongly maintained his fiscal and judicial rights vis-a-vis in the French church against ever more unpopular and oppressive papal claims. John of Joinville's biography of Louis IX contains some delightful anecdotes about Louis as a ruler. The best known tell of the king, with his councillors dispensing justice in the public gardens of Paris, or in the nearby Bois de Vincennes, sitting under an oak tree. His dress was much simpler than the elaborate finery of most medieval aristocrats. A plain woolen tunic, a simple surcoat of linsey woolsey, a mixture of linen and wool, and a black taffeta cape, a classic portrait of an ideal medieval monarch, accessible to all, a veritable font of justice, and a caring and benevolent ruler. Louis, according to Joinville, believed that a king should be esteemed by his subjects, and is said to have remarked that he would prefer France to be governed by a Scotsman than by a king who was not loved. The Scots were widely regarded as barbarians. His principles could make him difficult, as when he threw overboard the dice which with his men were entertaining themselves on his ship, and tried to ban prostitution and drinking in taverns throughout France. More sensibly he advised moderation in dress, believing that it should be neither too rich nor too poor. His honesty, courage, and good sense emerge over and over again in the biography, and are qualities which endeared the king to posterity. He was canonised in 1297. His holiness was demonstrated to his contemporaries by acts of asceticism during his life, and the miracles of healing at his tomb. His cult was to enhance the prestige of the French monarchy in the future. His present achievement was to increase its power and give it a dominant and respected role in the political life of Western Europe. Here we have an interesting image here of Louis IX administering justice to subjects. So despite this harsh execution pictured above, he expanded the role played by the monarchy in hearing appeals against other courts and strongly encouraged the use of Roman law and judicial practice. He proved an effective ruler, curbing the endemic feudal wars and redistributing the tax burden more equitably and simplifying the administration. Louis IX departed on a crusade with his assembled army and felt strongly that the Holy Land should be under Christian rule. And here a page from an illuminated manuscript depicting scenes from the religious life of Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis for his piety and asceticism. He can be seen washing the feet of the poor, collecting relics of the saints, being whipped by a monk in penance, donating food to a monastery, and studying the Bible with the aid of a teacher. Imagine being asked to whip the king for penance. So we have a bit of Chronicles again here. So in 1264, according on the 25th of January at Amiens, the King of France made known his award. Louis IX and the Musulmans declared that the provisions of Oxford were null and void, and that the King of England should be free to choose his councillors as he wished. The award met with widespread hostility in England. After this, the king returned to England from overseas. The barons, however, were not content with the award of the King of France, but immediately levied war on the king's supporter, Roger Mortimer, in the Welsh marches. They razed all his castles, pillaged his lands, and burned his manors and villages. The Waverley Annals, written from a very pro-baronial point of view, describes the culmination in the struggle between King Henry III and his barons, the battles of Lewes and Evesham. This year saw a great battle between King Henry III and many of the barons of the realms of Lewes. Discontent between king and barons boiled up to such hatred that once the agreement which had been made earlier was breached by one side, then both rose up against each other with the greatest violence, plundering estates, seizing booty, burning down the finest dwellings, and razing several castles to the ground. With the kingdom in this turmoil, new evils were perpetrated daily, until it was widely believed that matters could be settled only by battle. King Henry III, therefore, after assembling his army, hastened first to the Cinque Ports. Having gained control of 3 of them after sieges, he sought to bind them more firmly to his allegiance, since they seemed reluctant to conform to his will. And when this news reached the wiser baronial party, that is to say that the much to be revered Simon de Montford, Earl of Leicester, and Gilbert of Clare, Earl of Gloucester, and their confederates, they too moved rapidly towards the Cinque Ports. Hearing of this, the king brought his army of nearly 60,000 fighting men from the ports to Lewes. The better party had only 50,000 troops, whose leaders were battle-hardened, but the rest mere youths. They were joined by the citizens of London, who had no experience of warfare and who took to flight at the first sight of battle. The baronial party sent a letter to the king, saying that they would willingly render him loyal service. Henry III replied without salutation that he cared nothing for their service, but instead regarded them as his foes. Thus he pronounced formal defiance against them as public enemies. Edward, the king's eldest son, and his uncle Richard, Earl of Cornwall, once called the King of the Romans, proclaimed that they would destroy not merely the possessions of the barons and their supporters, but indeed their very bodies. This grieved those who had longed for peace and who had offered many concessions to that end, all of which were spurned by the king's councillors, who threatened total ruin for those who made such proposals. Well, so you can see everybody really was in an impasse, and this was only going in one direction. Henry III and Westminster Abbey. So Westminster Abbey was Henry's attempt to beat Louis IX and the French at their own architectural game. So although he didn't visit Paris until 1254, he must have heard glowing reports of the stories and the glories of the French Gothic cathedrals and the Saint-Chapelle, begun entirely at Louis' expense in 1241. So in 1245, inspired to rival the generosity of his royal cousin, Henry declared that he would take on full financial responsibility for building a new fashionable church at Westminster to replace the church built by St. Edward the Confessor 2 centuries earlier. It had to be sufficiently imposing to fit England's coronation and royal burial church, and Henry also clearly intended it to be a giant reliquary like the Saint-Chapelle. Fortunately, in view of the king's unsteady financial position, Westminster Abbey already had its own precious relic in the body of its founder, St. Edward the Confessor, who had been canonised in 1161. So the Plantagenets could claim descent from Edward's family, and Henry seems to have conceived a deep personal attachment to the only saint the family could call their own. So although Westminster enshrined and celebrated an English saint, it was as cosmopolitan as Henry could make it. He commissioned an Italian, Pietro Dorisi, an expert in cosmati work, setting small tesserae of coloured marble or semi-precious stones into marble sheets to work on the base of St. Edward's shrine, on his own tomb, and on the choir pavement. He also sent masons to France to learn French stone-cutting techniques, and the first architect, Henri de Reims, had undoubtedly, as his name implies, worked at Reims Cathedral, although it's uncertain if he was English or French. Certainly the abbey bears eloquent witness to the ascendancy of French architecture in the 13th century. The vaults, for example, are higher than any of those of other English Gothic churches and are supported by flying buttresses, while chapels radiate from the aisle at the east end of the abbey, in marked contrast to the usual English square choirs and retro choirs. Bar tracery was used in all the windows, and unlike the other French notions described above, had an immediate and far-reaching effect on church architecture in England. Here's the king consulting his master masons and the vaulting of Westminster Abbey. You may have watched the recent coronation of King Charles III. Well, I suppose I shouldn't say recent, depending on when you're watching this video, but of course the abbey itself has borne witness to countless events over the centuries. We have some lovely illustrations to that effect as well. Here's Westminster Abbey. This is the view from the choir, looking up the screen to the high vaulting. Beautiful. There's an elegantly painted panel from a diptych in Westminster Abbey, gilded with gold leaf, inlaid with precious stones, and a floor tile from the chapter house bearing the 3 lions of the Plantagenet crest. And that brings us to the end of Henry's reign. So this is the effigy of Henry III in Westminster Abbey, on the tomb made for Edward the Confessor. It's from 1269. He achieved his heart's ambition when the new Abbey Church at Westminster was consecrated, and St. Edward the Confessor's body was translated to its new shrine within it. 3 years later, Henry died and was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the very tomb from which the Confessor had been removed. The Osney Abbey chronicler, in his epitaph to the king, noted that they loved aliens above all Englishmen and enriched them with innumerable gifts. Suddenly, in the patronage he gave to the Savoyards and the Lusignans, Henry was at odds with the growing feeling of Englishness that was characteristic of the 13th century. Yet, because of the loss of Normandy and Anjou, Henry, unlike his Plantagenet predecessors, lived almost entirely in England. He named his sons after English saints Edward and Edmund, and his reign brought a long period of internal peace which lasted from 1217 until the outbreak of civil war in 1263. Just before the outbreak of that war, the chronicler of Tewkesbury Abbey, on a false rumour of Henry's death, penned the king's obituary. Interestingly, it was entirely favourable, describing him as a lover and adorner of Holy Church, a protector and consoler of religious orders, a vigorous governor of the kingdoms, and well-respected restorer of peace and quiet, a generous giver of alms to the poor, and always a pious helper of widows and orphans. Not everyone, though, would agree that he'd been a rigorous ruler. Obituaries written and stories circulated after his death balanced Henry's piety with his simplicity. Dante placed him in purgatory as the simple king who sits apart. Salimbene recounted how Henry was thrilled when a jester told him he was like Christ, only to order the jester's execution when he heard the explanation. Concerning Christ, it is said that he was as wise at his birth as he was when he was 30. In the same way, you are as wise now as when you were an infant. His reign defined the position of the English monarchy until the end of the 15th century. It was a kingship limited by law, and in particular by the terms of Magna Carta, but it was not limited by anything more radical. The provisions of Oxford had failed, and no legal restraints could be imposed on the king's ability to do what he liked in the vital areas of policy, patronage, and appointments. The only real solution to a responsible monarchy would be the deposition of the king himself, a solution that the 14th century was to bring. I think here we can finish with this last entry in this chronicle, 1272. On the 2nd of April, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, departed this life, exchanging the passing glories of this world for the kingdom of heaven. On Wednesday, 16th of November, His Majesty King Henry III of England, of blessed memory, forsook his mortal existence and departed from this earthly life, exchanging the fleeting glory of the world for the palace in heaven, where he would reign with the eternal King of Kings. When the nobles of the realm had duly paid their last respects, he was buried with fitting honour on the feast of St. Edmund, King and Martyr, which was the following Sunday, in the noble church of Westminster, which he had founded. Henry III's body was fittingly decked out with the richest clothes and the royal crown. All believed that, when it was being carried by especially chosen nobles of the realm on a bier for burial, it shone with greater splendour than it had in life. By a remarkable coincidence, it so happened that it was in this very spot where the most blessed King, St. Edward the Confessor, had been buried, and where his body had lain for many years before his remains were transferred to his new shrine, that the body of King Henry III was placed with honour and laid in the tomb. In his lifetime, King Henry III had honoured St. Edward above all other saints, and had venerated him with special devotion. So that concludes this tour of Henry III's life. Chronicles in this age of chivalry. I've really enjoyed learning about things that I didn't even realise I didn't know, and I hope you did too. We'll move on to the next King Edward in our next instalment, and I look forward to having you join me.